It was late October of 2019 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small cabin I had rented in the north of England, near the edge of a forest in Cumbria. I had been working long hours in Manchester, and the noise of the city was starting to wear me down. The cabin seemed perfect, old but clean, surrounded by damp woods and open fields. The owner had left the keys under a stone near the front steps, and when I arrived in the afternoon, everything felt quiet and harmless. It was one of those cool, gray afternoons where the air feels thick with moisture and every sound carries a little too far. The cabin was small, just a kitchen, a sitting room, one bedroom, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and there was a faint smell of damp soil and old smoke inside. The walls were uneven, and the windows looked out toward the thick tree line. Behind the cabin, a thin dirt path led down toward a narrow stream that cut through the woods. The place felt old, but in a way that made me curious rather than scared at first. I unpacked my bag, made some tea, and tried to settle in. That first night, the rain came heavy. It hit the tin roof so hard that it sounded like tiny stones being thrown against it. I could hear the wind squeezing through the cracks in the window frames. The nearest town was about 6 miles away, and my phone signal was spotty, cutting in and out every few minutes. I didn't think much of it. I sat on the couch under a blanket and listened to the sound of the rain, the wind moving through the trees outside, and occasionally, the soft creaking of the old wood. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I had gotten up to use the bathroom, and when I passed by the front window, I noticed movement outside. It was brief, just a flicker of something pale between the trees, near the path that led down to the stream. I thought it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a person from a nearby farm taking a shortcut through the woods. The light from the cabin cast faint reflections on the wet glass, making it hard to see clearly. Still, something about the movement caught my attention because it seemed deliberate, like someone was standing there for a moment before disappearing back into the dark. I went back to bed, telling myself I was imagining things. The wind and rain outside made everything look alive. But I didn't sleep much after that. I kept hearing faint sounds outside, the kind that make you sit up and hold your breath to listen. Twigs snapping, something brushing against the side of the cabin, the creak of the front step. I kept convincing myself it was just the weather or an animal. The next morning, I went outside early. The air was cold and wet, and the grass squelched under my boots. I followed the path down toward the stream, trying to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. About 20 yards from the cabin, I noticed footprints in the mud, not mine. They were small, like a woman's, and barefoot. They were deep enough to be fresh, and they led from the tree line right up toward the back of the cabin, stopping near the window by the kitchen. My stomach tightened when I saw them. I didn't know what to think. Maybe someone had been out there during the night. Maybe it was one of the locals, someone lost or drunk or looking for something. I tried to reason with myself, but I couldn't ignore how strange it was. Who would be walking barefoot in freezing mud in the middle of the night? That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I cooked some food, read a bit, and tried not to look outside too often. The woods seemed thicker somehow, darker, as if the rain had washed the color out of everything. I noticed the silence the most. Not complete silence, but that heavy kind that sits between the wind gusts and distant rustling. By late afternoon, I felt like someone was watching me. It was that uneasy sense you get when your instincts kick in before your mind catches up. I looked out the window several times, but there was nothing, just wet branches, fog moving low to the ground, and the dim light fading fast. That night, I didn't turn off all the lights before going to bed. I left the kitchen light on, just enough to see shapes if I had to. The rain had stopped, but the wind was still there. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again, not from a sound, but from the feeling that something was wrong. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. Then I heard it, slow footsteps on the front porch. Not the creaking of wood shifting in the wind, but actual steps. One after another. I froze, not daring to move. The steps stopped near the door. For a few seconds, everything went completely silent. I could hear my own breathing, quick and shallow. Then there was a faint scrape against the glass window beside the door, like a fingertip or a nail dragging across it. It was so soft that I thought I might be imagining it. I waited. Nothing else happened. After about 10 minutes, I forced myself to get up, grabbed the flashlight, and peeked through the curtain. There was no one there, but what I did see made my skin crawl. Muddy footprints on the porch. The same small, barefoot prints I had seen near the stream that morning. They were wet and dark, and they stopped right at the door. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed up until dawn, sitting in the corner of the room with the flashlight in my hand, listening. The next morning, I walked around the cabin to check. The footprints were real. They led away from the porch this time, back toward the woods. The ground was disturbed in several places, as if someone had been standing there watching for a while. By then, I was shaken enough to consider leaving. But I told myself it would be ridiculous to drive all the way back just because of some muddy footprints. I tried to be logical. Maybe some vagrant or hiker was using the area for shelter. Maybe they'd already moved on. That evening, I lit the small wood stove and tried to distract myself. The air was still damp and cold, and the light faded quickly. Around 7 p.m., I looked out the back window toward the tree line, and that's when I saw her. She was standing near the edge of the woods, half hidden by the branches. I could just make out her shape, thin, pale, wearing something white that looked soaked through. Her hair hung flat against her head, and she wasn't moving. She was just standing there, facing the cabin. I froze, staring at her through the glass. The strange thing was how still she was, completely motionless. I blinked several times, thinking maybe I was seeing a trick of the light, but she didn't move or vanish. I stepped back from the window slowly, heart racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. When I looked again, she was gone. That was the moment I decided to leave. I packed my bag as fast as I could, throwing things in without folding them. When I stepped outside, the air was freezing. I kept my flashlight low and hurried toward my car. The trees were silent. No wind now, no rain. Halfway to the car, I stopped. There were fresh footprints again, the same small, barefoot ones, leading from the woods directly toward the cabin. And then, halfway along the path, they turned. They led toward where I was standing. That was enough. I ran the rest of the way, jumped into the car, and locked the doors. I started the engine and drove off without looking back. The road was narrow and winding, and I didn't care about the mud or the branches scraping the car as I went. I drove until I reached the main road and didn't stop until I was well past the next town. When I finally calmed down, I pulled over at a petrol station. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my drink. I kept replaying what I saw, that figure standing so still at the edge of the woods, the footprints, the dragging sound on the glass. Later, when I contacted the owner to tell him I was leaving early, he sounded surprised. He said no one had lived anywhere near that cabin in years. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. I didn't argue. I just drove home and never went back. Even now, I sometimes think about that night, about those small barefoot prints in the mud, and how silent everything was just before I saw her. I still don't know who she was or what she was doing there, but every time I picture her standing by the trees in that soaked white dress, watching the cabin without moving, I feel the same cold weight in my chest. And what makes it worse is that, before I left, I had checked the mud by my car. There had been one more set of prints there too, leading right up to my door. It had been raining for 3 straight days before I decided to finally start building that small cabin I'd been planning for months. I was 31 then, working as a part-time mechanic in a small town outside Aberdeen, Scotland. I had bought a small plot of land deep in the woods, about 2 hours from where I lived. The idea was to build a quiet little cabin where I could get away from everything on weekends. No noise, no people, just the sound of rain and trees. I didn't expect it to become one of the most disturbing nights of my life. I arrived there late that afternoon, around 5 or 6, with the back of my old van full of wood panels, nails, a hammer, and a few tools I had borrowed from the shop. The sky was already heavy and gray, the kind of color that tells you the rain isn't going to stop anytime soon. The air was thick with that damp forest smell, wet pine, mud, and the faint rot of fallen leaves. The ground squished under my boots when I stepped out. Everything felt cold and heavy, the air, my jacket, even the light. I picked a small clearing about 50 meters off an old logging road. It was surrounded by trees so tall I couldn't see much of the horizon. I could still hear the rain hitting the canopy above, and sometimes it would break through in drops, hitting my hood and shoulders. The soil was soft and dark, perfect for digging a foundation. I set up a tarp between 2 trees to keep my tools dry, but the wind kept pulling at it. It snapped and flapped above me like a loose sail. I started working, trying not to think too much about the weather. The sound of the hammer was dull against the constant drizzle. I worked steady, piece by piece, laying down the frame, adjusting the boards, wiping rain off my hands. The rain soaked through my gloves and sleeves, and soon my hands were raw from the cold. Still, I kept going. I wanted to at least get the frame and part of the roof up before dark. By the time I had half the structure standing, the light was fading fast. The sky had turned from gray to nearly black, and the rain grew heavier. The drops hit the wood like small stones. The air had that sharp chill that crawls into your bones when you've been wet for too long. I lit the small portable lantern I'd brought and set it on an overturned crate beside me. Its yellow light cut through the darkness just enough to see what I was doing. The mist around the light made everything look hazy, like I was working underwater. The woods had gone quiet except for the rain. No birds, no rustling, nothing but water and the creaking sound of trees shifting in the wind. I remember pausing once, just listening. The silence underneath the rain felt strange, almost too complete. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the weather. Animals stayed hidden when it poured like that. Around 9 or so, I stopped to eat. I sat inside the half-built frame of the cabin, with the lantern beside me, eating cold beans from a tin. My clothes were soaked through, and my hands were trembling from the cold. I remember how the wood smell mixed with the wet earth. It was strong, almost bitter. I could feel every muscle in my back aching from the lifting and hammering. While I sat there, I noticed something odd. The rain had softened, but underneath it, I heard another sound. It was faint, like something moving through wet grass. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, and listened. Came again, a slow, dragging noise. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It came from behind the tree line, maybe 30 meters away. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or even a boar, but the sound wasn't right for that. It wasn't a steady walk or a rustle. It was uneven. Step, drag, step, drag. I set down my food and picked up the flashlight. The beam cut through the rain, lighting the thick trunks and wet ground, but I couldn't see anything moving, just trees swaying in the wind. I waited, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand, but the noise had stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen or water running off a log. I went back to work after eating, forcing myself not to think about it. The sound of hammering helped drown out everything else. But every so often, I'd pause just to listen. I kept thinking I heard something out there. Sometimes it sounded closer. By 11, the rain turned into a full storm. The wind howled through the trees, and the tarp ripped loose from one side. I ran to fix it, nearly slipping in the mud. My flashlight beam wobbled as I retied the rope. That's when I noticed fresh footprints near the edge of the clearing. They were faint but visible in the mud, human prints, not boots like mine, but bare feet. They led from the trees and stopped just a few meters from where I was working. My stomach dropped. I crouched down, staring at them. The rain had already started to fill them in, but I could still make out the shape of toes and heels. I looked around, shining the flashlight through the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness. My first thought was that someone had been watching me. Maybe some hiker got lost. But the prints were fresh, and it was almost midnight in the middle of nowhere. I packed up my tools fast, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Still, I couldn't leave the half-built cabin open, so I threw the tarp over the structure, tied it down tight, and carried my things into the van. The rain was hammering on the roof now. I decided I'd sleep in the van for the night and leave at first light. Inside, it was dark except for the lantern on the dashboard. The windows were fogged, and I could hear the rain pouring on the roof. I tried to rest, but every sound outside made me tense. At one point, I heard that dragging noise again. This time it was closer, right outside the van. I didn't move. I just sat there, breathing shallow, staring at the fogged windshield. The sound circled the van slowly, soft but clear. I could hear wet footsteps, sloshing in the mud. Then a faint tap against the back door. Just once. Then nothing. My hands were shaking as I turned off the lantern, plunging the van into darkness. I sat completely still, listening. After a long minute, the footsteps moved away, fading back into the rain. I didn't sleep that night. I waited, wide awake, until the first weak light of morning broke through the mist. When I stepped outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I checked around the van, more footprints. They circled it completely, some overlapping with mine from the night before. They led back toward the trees, and that's where I stopped following. I didn't go back to finish that cabin for weeks. When I did, I brought a friend along, and by then most of the site was covered in new growth and leaves. The ground had dried out, and any sign of those footprints was long gone. We finished the cabin together over the next few weekends. It stood there solid and quiet by the time we were done. But even now, years later, I can't stay there overnight. Whenever it rains hard, that same dragging sound still comes back to me. I can hear it clearly in my head. The slow, wet steps moving through the dark, circling the van, stopping just close enough to let me know someone was out there. I never saw who it was. I never want to. Sometimes I wonder if it was someone living out there, hidden in those woods, maybe watching anyone who came too close. The land stretched miles without another cabin or house in sight. I didn't tell anyone about what I found that night. People would just say I imagined it. But I know what I heard, and I know those footprints were real. That small cabin still stands there, quiet under the trees. I keep it locked now, just a place I use for storage. But every time I drive out there to check on it, I still get that same uneasy feeling when the rain starts to fall, the way it did that night. The sound of water dripping through the trees, the wind pushing against the roof, the smell of wet soil. I can't stay long. I finish what I need to do and leave before dark, because some part of me knows that whatever was out there that night might still be. And that's enough to make me keep the lights on when it rains, even back home. It was the summer of 2011 when I decided to take a short trip to a small cabin I rented in northern Michigan. I'd been working long weeks in the city, and the idea of quiet woods and cool lake air sounded like something I desperately needed. The cabin wasn't big, just one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a screened porch that looked out toward a small clearing. Beyond that clearing was a thick stretch of pine trees that ran for miles. The man I rented the place from told me the cabin hadn't been used much that year. He'd mentioned something about raccoons getting into the trash and the occasional black bear wandering near the lake, but nothing too serious. I didn't mind. I'd grown up near the woods and had been around enough wildlife to not get bothered easily. The first couple of days were calm. I woke up early, made coffee, and watched fog roll off the lake. I spent most of the days hiking along small dirt trails, taking pictures, and reading old paperbacks on the porch while the sun went down. At night, it got dark. Darker than I expected. The kind of dark where even the trees disappear into blackness, and all you can hear is the low hum of insects and the occasional rustle of something moving through the brush. It was on the third night when things started to feel different. I was sitting on the porch just after sunset, watching the last bit of light fade behind the trees. The air had cooled down fast, and I remember pulling on an old sweatshirt. I noticed a faint shape near the tree line. Not close, maybe 40 or 50 yards away. It looked like someone standing still, half hidden behind a pine trunk. I thought maybe it was just a trick of the light or maybe a tree that looked oddly shaped. I didn't think much of it. I turned on the small porch light and went back inside. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to pull me out of sleep. It sounded like something metal had been knocked over. I laid there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to tell if I had dreamed it. Then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound near the porch. I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the bed and went to the window. The porch was empty. The trash bin that I'd pushed against the railing was tipped over, garbage scattered across the wooden planks. Probably a raccoon, I thought. Still, something about the silence didn't sit right. Normally, when animals get into trash, they make more noise. Scurrying, chewing, little snorts and squeaks. This was quiet. Too quiet. I waited by the window for a minute or two, then went back to bed, trying not to overthink it. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt by the porch steps. They weren't clear enough to see shape or size, just shallow impressions in the dry soil. They looked human, but they could have been distorted by rain or movement. I brushed it off and went about my day. Still, I caught myself looking toward the tree line more often than usual. That evening, I built a small fire pit out back. The woods looked calm again, the same kind of peace that makes you forget the world exists. I sat near the fire for a while, cooking a bit of food on a small pan, listening to the crackle and the faint sound of loons calling across the lake. Around 9 p.m., I put out the fire and went inside. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to convince myself that I was just getting jumpy from being alone. But that night, it came back. I woke again sometime after 1 a.m. This time it was footsteps, slow, crunching footsteps moving along the gravel near the porch. They weren't heavy like a bear, not quick like a deer, just slow, steady, human-like steps. I stayed still, barely breathing. I could hear the soft rhythm of it circling the cabin, pausing every few seconds. Then came a faint thump against the wall, near the window by the kitchen. I didn't move. I just listened. My flashlight was beside me, but I didn't turn it on. The sound went on for maybe a minute, then faded away toward the woods. I stayed awake for hours after that, staring at the faint outlines of the furniture in the dim moonlight coming through the curtains. In the morning, I walked around the cabin. The ground was disturbed again. Patches of dirt and pine needles shifted like someone had walked around during the night. The trash bin was upright this time, but the lid had been moved and was sitting a few feet away. The weird thing was that it wasn't torn open or scattered. It was as if someone had looked through it carefully. I started feeling uneasy about being there alone. I checked my phone, but there was no signal unless I walked nearly half a mile down the road toward the main highway. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but I convinced myself to stay one more night. I didn't want to feel like I'd run off because of some noises. That afternoon, I took a walk deeper into the woods behind the cabin. About a quarter-mile in, I came across a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. There was something odd there. A pile of old junk, rusted metal pieces, and broken wood. It looked like parts of a small shed or maybe an old hunting post that had collapsed. Nearby, I saw what looked like the remains of a small fire pit, but the ashes were still dark, like it had been used recently. There were also small bones scattered around. Animal bones, I think, but I didn't look too closely. The air felt heavier there, and I decided to head back before the sun started going down. That night, I made sure every door and window was locked tight. I pulled the curtains closed and left a light on in the kitchen. I stayed up reading until my eyes hurt. Around 11 p.m., I finally drifted off. It didn't last long. I woke to the sound of something tapping on the glass. Slow, rhythmic taps, like someone was running their finger along the window frame. My stomach tightened. The sound moved from one window to another, circling the cabin just like before. I could hear soft breathing outside, not loud but close. Too close. I stayed perfectly still, listening as the sound shifted to the front door. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, there was a faint creak, the porch boards flexing under weight. I heard the doorknob rattle, slow and quiet. I'd locked it, but hearing it move like that made my skin crawl. I sat there in the dark, clutching the flashlight, barely breathing. The knob rattled once more, then silence. I didn't move again until the first light of morning crept through the curtains. When I stepped outside, I saw clear prints in the dirt, long barefoot impressions, too long to be normal. They led from the tree line around the porch and back again. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into the deeper woods. That was enough for me. I packed everything within an hour and left the cabin as fast as my old truck could take me. When I reached the small gas station near the highway, the man behind the counter asked if I'd been staying up near Lake Munson. I nodded, and he gave me a look like he already knew something. He said a few campers had reported hearing noises up that way lately. Thought it might be some drifter living off the land, maybe someone not right in the head. That explanation made sense, but it didn't sit right. The way it moved, the silence between the sounds, the way the trash wasn't torn but sorted. It felt like whoever or whatever had been there wasn't just wandering. It was watching. I never went back to that cabin again. A few months later, I looked it up online out of curiosity, and it had been taken off the rental listings. The owner said he stopped leasing it out after someone broke in and trashed the place. He didn't say what was taken. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that moment. The soft tap on the window, the breathing just outside the wall. I tell myself it was a drifter, some stranger passing through, but the way those footsteps moved, slow and deliberate, made me feel like it knew exactly where I was the whole time. And that thought alone has kept me away from the woods ever since. It was October of 2019 when I decided to take a week off from work and drive out to a small cabin I'd rented in northern Utah. I was 32 then, working in construction, burnt out from the constant noise and chaos of city life. The listing said the cabin was deep in the woods near the Uinta Mountains. Remote, quiet, surrounded by nothing but pine and open land. That was exactly what I needed. The drive took nearly 5 hours from Salt Lake City. The last 40 minutes were all dirt roads, narrow, twisting paths through dense forest. The signal on my phone had dropped long before I reached the cabin, and I relied on a printed map I'd brought just in case. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled up in front of the place. The cabin was small, made of old, dark wood with a green metal roof that looked like it had been there for decades. The porch sagged slightly, and there was a faint smell of smoke in the air, like someone had burned wood recently. I remember how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, heavy quiet. No wind, no birds, just stillness. The forest around me felt too still, like it was holding its breath. I tried to brush off that feeling as city nerves, grabbed my duffel bag, and went inside. The cabin was simple. One main room with a small kitchen, a stone fireplace, a table, and a bed in the corner. There was a back door that led into the woods. Everything smelled like old timber and dust. I set down my bag, opened the small windows to let some air in, and unpacked a few things. That first evening was fine. I made some food on a small propane stove, lit a candle, and read a book until the sun went down. By nightfall, the temperature dropped fast. The cabin didn't have power, just a lantern and a few candles, so I built a fire in the fireplace. The flames flickered across the walls, and I sat on the old couch, listening to the crackling wood. Outside, the forest was pitch black. Then I heard something, faint, like someone walking outside. The sound was slow, deliberate, crunching through the dry leaves. I froze and listened. It wasn't close, maybe 50 feet away, but it moved with purpose. I thought maybe it was a deer or maybe a stray dog. I tried to ignore it, but it went on for several minutes. Then it stopped completely. The silence that followed felt worse. I forced myself to shrug it off and went to bed. The next morning, I found tracks near the side of the cabin. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but they weren't clear. The dirt was soft and damp, and the prints were large. Too large for a normal animal, almost like human footprints, but longer, thinner, and oddly shaped, as if the toes were stretched out. I crouched down to look closer, but told myself it must have been the way the soil had shifted. I didn't want to start overthinking. That day, I hiked a few miles into the woods. The air was cold and crisp, and the deeper I went, the quieter it got. I didn't see any other cabins or signs of people, not even a trail marker. Around noon, I reached a small clearing with a pile of stones stacked oddly in the middle. It didn't look natural, more like someone had built it deliberately. Some of the stones were stained dark, almost reddish. It made me uneasy, so I turned back. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees. I made a quick dinner, fed the fire, and sat again by the window, staring out into the woods. The forest looked endless, black trunks vanishing into shadow. Around 9 that night, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer, much closer. Slow, heavy steps circling the cabin. I turned off the lantern and stood still, listening. My heartbeat was loud in my chest. The steps stopped at the back door. Then there was scratching, light, uneven, like nails or something rough dragging against the wood. I didn't move. The sound went on for almost a minute, then stopped. I waited another 10 before moving. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the door. No sound, no movement. But when I finally opened it just a crack, the smell hit me. Strong, metallic, like blood mixed with wet soil. I shut the door fast and bolted it. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I found deep scratch marks on the door, long and thin, cutting into the wood. Whatever made them had strength. I walked around the cabin, checking everything. On the far side near the trees, I found something else. A piece of torn fabric stuck on a low branch. It was dirty, brownish, but looked like a part of a shirt sleeve. I didn't remember seeing it before. I spent that day staying near the cabin. Every time I looked at the tree line, I thought I saw movement. A shape, maybe, but too far to make out. At one point, I heard what sounded like my name. Not clearly, not like someone speaking, but faintly, carried on the wind. I knew there was no one out there, so I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. That night, I didn't light the fire. I thought maybe whoever or whatever was out there would go away if they thought the cabin was empty. I sat in the dark, watching through the small window. Around midnight, the forest seemed to come alive with sound. Branches snapped in the distance, and I could hear fast movements, something running or darting between trees. It wasn't one thing. It sounded like several, moving irregularly, almost human but not quite. Then I saw it. Something moving at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the faint light of the moon. It was crouched low to the ground. First, I thought it was a man, but as it moved, its shape looked wrong. The limbs were too long. The way it bent and shifted looked unnatural, as if the joints didn't work the way they should. Crawled a few steps, then stood upright. It was tall, taller than any person I'd ever seen, and I swear I saw something pale reflecting off its face. It looked like skin, but stretched too tight, almost like it didn't belong there. I froze completely. The thing stood there for a long time, motionless, just facing the cabin. Then it slowly tilted its head to one side, the motion sharp and jerky. My stomach turned. I stayed still until it disappeared back into the darkness. I didn't sleep at all that night. When daylight came, I packed up my things fast. But when I tried to start my truck, it wouldn't turn over. The engine sputtered, then died completely. The battery had drained somehow. I opened the hood. All the wires looked fine, but there was a strange smear on the front bumper, like mud but darker. I decided I'd walk until I found a signal or a road. I locked the cabin and started walking down the dirt road. The forest was dead quiet again. Every few minutes, I'd look over my shoulder. At one point, maybe a mile down, I thought I saw something off to the right between the trees, the same tall shape, keeping distance but following. I didn't stop. I just kept walking. Took me nearly 2 hours before I saw another vehicle. A park ranger truck pulled up and offered help. I told him my truck wouldn't start. He drove me back to the cabin. When we got there, the front door was wide open. Inside, everything was scattered. My bag torn open, clothes ripped, and deep scratches across the walls. The ranger looked uneasy but said nothing. He helped me tow the truck and drove me back to town. A few weeks later, I got a call from the property owner. He asked if I'd noticed anything strange. I told him yes, but I didn't go into details. He said other guests had complained too, noises, footprints, even missing belongings. Some locals had told him stories about people going missing in those woods. I never went back. To this day, I can still picture that figure, tall, wrong, almost human but not. The way it moved, the way it seemed to know where I was. I've tried to convince myself it was just a trick of light, maybe an animal that looked strange in the dark. But every now and then, when I'm out late and hear something move in the distance, my mind goes back to that cabin. And the part that still keeps me up sometimes isn't what I saw. It's what the ranger said quietly, almost to himself, when he noticed those marks on the wall before we left. He muttered, "Those look fresh." He said it had been abandoned for over a month before I arrived. It had been nearly 7 years since I'd last seen that old cabin. 7 years since I packed up my things and drove away from the life I had built with him. My ex-husband, Mark, had always liked isolation. He said it gave him peace. To me, it always felt like a slow suffocation. After the divorce, I told myself I'd never set foot near that place again. But life has a strange way of dragging you back to places you thought you'd buried for good. It was early October of 2016 when I found myself driving down that same narrow dirt road in northern Montana, the one that wound through miles of pine forest before opening into the small clearing where the cabin stood. Mark had died 3 months earlier, heart attack, they said, and the cabin was now technically mine. I didn't want it, but before selling it, I needed to go through what was left inside. There were things I had stored there years ago, things I couldn't bring myself to throw away when I left. The road was rough, overgrown with weeds, and the air felt colder than I remembered. My car bumped over potholes as the trees thickened around me, their branches hanging low, heavy with damp autumn air. The sky was gray, swollen with clouds that promised rain, and the forest had that quiet heaviness that made every sound, every rustle, every crack, feel amplified. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked worse than I expected. The paint had peeled off most of the siding, and one of the shutters hung loose on a single hinge. The porch sagged slightly on one side, and the once clear windows were now coated with a thin layer of grime. The place looked abandoned, forgotten, like something that should have been swallowed by the woods long ago. I parked near the edge of the clearing and got out, my boots crunching against the scattered pine needles. The air smelled like wet earth and rotting leaves. The wind moved through the trees in uneven bursts, carrying a faint metallic scent that I couldn't place. I stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin, and felt that old heaviness settle in my chest. The kind I used to feel during those long, silent winters with Mark. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick and stale. Dust floated in the dim light that slipped through the windows. The living room was just as I remembered it. The same old brown sofa with a tear on the armrest, the stone fireplace stacked with half-burned logs, the faded rug that had once been red but was now the color of rust. Everything was still there, his things, my things, all of it frozen in time. On the coffee table sat a cracked mug, the one he used every morning for coffee. A stack of old magazines leaned against the wall. I walked through the cabin slowly, each step stirring the dust from the floorboards. My heart felt heavy, but not from grief, more from a strange unease, like I was trespassing somewhere I no longer belonged. The bedroom was worse. The smell of mildew hit me first. The sheets were still on the bed, stained and stiff from age. A few of his shirts still hung in the closet, though the edges had been chewed through by moths. I found a box beneath the bed. My old journals, photos, some papers from when we were married. I sat on the floor and went through them, the sound of the wind outside pressing against the walls. After an hour or so, I decided to stay the night. The drive back to town was too long, and the road wasn't something I wanted to navigate in the dark. I had brought a sleeping bag and some food. The idea of sleeping there again made my stomach twist, but I told myself it was just one night. By dusk, the rain had started. It wasn't heavy at first, just a steady patter against the roof, but it grew stronger as the evening went on. I lit a few candles, made some instant noodles, and tried to read one of the old paperbacks I found on the shelf. The sound of the rain on the tin roof drowned out most other noises, and for a while it was almost calming. But as the night deepened, that calmness turned into something else. The wind had picked up, and every gust made the cabin creak and groan like it was alive. The rain lashed against the windows, and I started to notice a faint rhythmic thumping sound from outside, like something loose was hitting the outer wall. I figured it was a branch, but the sound didn't match the movement of the wind. It came and went, steady, like footsteps circling the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but the more I listened, the more it unnerved me. It wasn't constant, just occasional dull thuds that would stop for minutes, then start again from a different side. When I finally gathered enough courage to look outside through the window, all I saw was darkness. The rain made everything blurry, and the faint reflection of the candlelight on the glass made it impossible to see beyond a few feet. I shut the curtains and tried to convince myself it was just a loose shutter. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. By midnight, the rain had softened, but the forest was filled with noises. Snapping twigs, shifting branches, faint movements that didn't sound like wind. I kept listening, heart pounding, until finally exhaustion pulled me into a light sleep. When I woke, it was still dark. My phone said 3:47 a.m. The rain had stopped completely, and the air felt colder. The cabin was silent except for the occasional drip of water from the roof. I rolled over in my sleeping bag, but then I noticed something. The smell. It was faint at first, but sharp. Metallic, mixed with something sour, like rust and wet soil. It seemed to come from near the door. My chest tightened. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. Nothing. Just the same clutter, the same furniture. But when I turned the light toward the floor near the door, I saw it. Muddy footprints. Fresh ones. They led from the front door into the cabin, across the floor, stopping just a few feet from where I slept. My throat went dry. I sat frozen, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I hadn't heard the door open. The lock was still in place. Whoever had been here must have entered before I went to sleep, or maybe while I was asleep, and then left. I followed the prints slowly, every sound making me flinch. They stopped near the far wall, then turned around and went back to the door. The trail ended right at the threshold. I checked the door again. It was locked, but the bottom corner looked slightly warped, like it had been forced open and then pushed back into place. My heart wouldn't stop racing. I didn't know what to do, so I waited until sunrise, sitting on the floor with the flashlight still on, staring at that door. When the first light came through the window, I grabbed my things and went outside. The ground was soft and muddy from the rain, and the footprints were there, two large, heavy ones leading from the tree line straight to the porch. They circled the cabin once, then stopped near the side window before heading back into the woods. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. I knew enough. Someone had been there that night, walking around while I slept, maybe watching me, maybe waiting. I left everything inside and drove away without looking back. The road felt longer this time, and I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I reached town, I called a real estate agent and told them to sell the property as it was. I didn't care about the price. A week later, the agent called to say the cabin had been sold to a local hunter. I felt relief for a moment, but it didn't last. A few days after that, I got another call, this time from the county sheriff. They had found the new owner dead near the edge of the property. The report said he'd been attacked by a wild animal. But the strange thing was, they never found any animal tracks nearby. That was the last time I ever heard about that cabin. I sold the land, changed my number, and never went back to Montana. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about those muddy footprints on the floor, how they stopped right beside me, how quiet everything had been. And every time I do, I wonder if it had really been an animal that killed that man, or if someone had never really left those woods after all. It was late October of 1998 when I decided to take a few days off and head up to a small cabin my uncle used to own in northern Idaho. The place had been sitting empty for years after he passed away, and since I had some time off work and needed to clear my head, it felt like the right spot. The cabin sat near a narrow dirt road, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to lean inwards, shutting out the world. I drove my old Ford truck up the winding mountain path, the road getting worse the deeper I went, with branches scraping along the sides of the truck and gravel spitting under the tires. The sun had already dipped low, throwing long shadows across the trail, and the air was colder than I remembered from the city. The cabin came into view after about 4 hours of driving. It looked smaller than I'd imagined. The wood darkened and cracked from years of neglect. The roof had moss on one side, and part of the porch was sagging. Still, it stood solid enough. The place had no electricity, just a wood stove, a couple of kerosene lamps, and an old generator that I doubted still worked. I unloaded the back of my truck, some canned food, my sleeping bag, a few tools, and my dog, Riley. He jumped out, sniffing around the front steps before disappearing around the side of the cabin. Inside smelled like old wood and dust. The air was stale, and there was a faint trace of smoke from years of fires burned in the stove. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked through. There were still a few of my uncle's things lying around. An old coffee mug, a stack of yellowed newspapers from 1993, a hunting knife on the table with a rusted handle. I swept out the dust and cobwebs, then started a fire in the stove to warm the place up. Riley curled up near the door, his tail flicking every now and then. By the time night came, I was sitting by the fire, eating from a can of beans, listening to the wood crackle. There were no sounds outside except the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I'd brought no radio, no TV, nothing to distract me, just quiet. When I finally turned in for the night, I could hear the wind pushing against the cabin walls, faintly whistling through the cracks. Riley stayed near the foot of my bed, ears twitching every few minutes. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't the wind. It was sharper, more deliberate, like wood snapping under weight. I stayed still, listening. Then another sound came, closer this time. I sat up slowly, staring into the dark room, the fire now just a faint glow in the stove. Riley was already up, standing stiff, head tilted toward the door. His ears were up, and his body was tense. That was enough to put me on edge. I reached for the flashlight beside the bed and flicked it on. The beam caught dust floating in the air. I scanned around the room, then turned it toward the window. Nothing but the reflection of my own face staring back. Riley growled low under his breath, the kind of sound that comes from deep in a dog's chest when they know something isn't right. I waited a while before I heard it again, this time from behind the cabin. A dragging sound, heavy and slow. I slipped on my boots, grabbed the flashlight, and opened the back door. The cold air hit me like a slap. My breath came out white in the beam of the light. I moved around the corner slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The ground was covered in pine needles and damp leaves. Riley stayed behind me, quiet but alert. Near the edge of the tree line, I saw something dark against the ground. I walked closer and realized it was a large deer carcass. Its neck was twisted unnaturally, and the back half of it looked like it had been dragged. The wound wasn't clean, torn open, like something strong had pulled it apart. The blood had already soaked into the dirt, dark and sticky. I'd seen plenty of deer hit by cars before, but not like this. There were drag marks that led further into the woods. I followed them a few steps, but the flashlight caught movement deeper in the trees, something big shifting just out of range. My pulse quickened. I couldn't see what it was, just the shape of something moving slowly, maybe crouched low. I stood there a few seconds, trying to convince myself it was just another animal, maybe a bear. But there was something off about the way it moved, too quiet, too careful. I backed away and went inside, locking the door behind me. I added more wood to the fire and sat in the chair near the window, flashlight in hand. I stayed awake for hours just listening. Every now and then, I thought I heard something brushing against the wall or crunching outside. Riley wouldn't relax. He stayed sitting up, facing the door. The next morning, I went out again. The carcass was gone. Only the bloodstains were left in the dirt, and the drag marks had faded. I tried to shake it off, but something about it didn't feel right. There were no paw prints or tracks around it, just drag marks that disappeared into the trees. I spent the rest of the day fixing the porch and keeping busy, trying not to think about it. That night, it started raining. The roof leaked near the corner of the kitchen, so I set a bucket there. Riley stayed close to me as I read through one of my uncle's old notebooks. He used to write down notes about hunting trips, weather conditions, animal tracks, sightings. Toward the end of the notebook, I noticed a few entries about something he'd found near the same area. He didn't describe it clearly, just mentioned something watching from the ridge and heavy movement around camp. The last note was dated 2 weeks before he died in a hunting accident out there. I went to bed uneasy that night. The rain hitting the roof was loud, constant, and the wind made the trees groan. Sometime in the early morning hours, I woke up again. Riley was whining, low and restless. Then I heard it, a thud against the side of the cabin. Then another, heavier, something brushing against the wall, dragging along it. I held my breath. My first thought was a bear trying to get in. I reached for my rifle, loaded a round, and waited. The dragging stopped, replaced by slow footsteps circling the cabin. I moved to the window and looked out. The rain made visibility poor, but in the light of the flashlight, I caught something that made my stomach drop. A boot print, fresh, deep in the mud right below the window. It wasn't an animal. Someone had been out there. I stayed awake until daylight, every nerve on edge. When I finally stepped outside, I saw the prints clearly. They led around the cabin to the back door, then off into the trees. They weren't mine. I could see the pattern, an old hiking boot with a worn sole. Someone had been right outside while I was sleeping. That was it for me. I packed up that morning, threw everything into the truck, and got ready to leave. But when I opened the driver's door, I noticed something that made my hands freeze. On the seat was my uncle's old hunting knife, the same one that had been on the cabin table when I arrived. It was lying there clean, blade folded in. I hadn't touched it since the first night. I didn't stay another minute. I started the truck and drove down that dirt road until I hit the main highway. The entire drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the road. When I got back to town, I called the local sheriff and told him about the boot prints and the carcass. He said they'd send someone up there to check, but I never heard back. A few weeks later, I went through some of my uncle's old photos that my mother had kept. In one of them, taken a year before he died, he was standing on the same porch, holding up a fish he'd caught. Behind him, half hidden by the trees, there was a faint figure in the background. Someone standing near the edge of the woods, watching. It's been over 20 years since I went to that cabin, and I never went back. I still remember the feeling of being watched, that cold sense of something human but wrong moving out there in the dark. Sometimes when I drive through back roads or stop near tree lines, I get that same tightness in my chest. The cabin still stands, from what I've heard, but no one goes near it anymore. The man who bought the land after my uncle's death moved out after just one winter. He said the woods made him feel like he wasn't alone out there. I don't know who or what was out there that night. All I know is that something was, and whoever left that knife in my truck wanted me to know it. It was early November of 2014 when I decided to spend a few nights at the old cabin near Pine Hollow Creek. It was a place I hadn't been to in years, tucked far off a narrow gravel road that wound through the thick woods of northern Montana. I had built that cabin myself almost 15 years earlier, back when I was in my late 20s. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small square building with a tin roof, a wood stove, a cot, and a small porch that looked out over the trees. I had left it mostly untouched for the past decade, but something about that fall made me want to go back. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the thought of being somewhere where my phone didn't ring every few minutes. I brought my dog, Max, a 7-year-old black Labrador who had been with me through almost everything. He was loyal, calm, and never barked unless there was a reason. I loaded up the truck with firewood, some cans of food, an old sleeping bag, and a single duffel of clothes. The sky was heavy and gray when I left town. By the time I reached the tree line, it had started to drizzle. The last stretch of the road was mostly mud, with deep tire grooves that filled with rainwater. I could hear the tires slipping as I pushed the truck forward. The forest around me was dark and silent, except for the soft patter of rain hitting the windshield and the occasional creak of branches in the wind. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was already past 6 in the evening. The light was fading fast, and the woods around the cabin looked thicker than I remembered. The cabin looked smaller than it used to. The wood had darkened with age, the roof had patches of rust, and moss had spread across the stone foundation. I stepped out, breathing in the cold, damp air. Max jumped from the truck and started sniffing around the porch immediately. His tail wagged, but his movements were alert. He circled the cabin once before coming back to me. Inside, it smelled like dust, old pine, and mildew. The first thing I noticed was that the floorboards had warped slightly, and there were bits of leaves near the door, probably carried in by wind through the small cracks. I dropped my bag and lit the lantern I'd brought. The soft yellow light filled the space just enough to make out the corners. Everything was still where I'd left it years ago. The iron stove, the small wooden table, the cot against the far wall, and the shelf with old cans and tools. Took a while to get the fire going. The wood was a bit damp, and the wind outside kept pushing smoke back into the cabin until the flames caught. Once it was burning steadily, I cooked a can of beans and ate with Max lying near the door, his head resting on his paws. The rain grew heavier as the night deepened. The sound of it hitting the roof was steady and rhythmic at first, but around midnight, it started to change. It became sharper, like something harder than rain hitting the metal. Small thuds, irregular, spaced out. At first, I thought maybe pine cones were falling from the trees, loosened by the wind. But when I stepped outside with my flashlight, I didn't see any branches moving. The forest was still. The beam of light cut through the mist and stopped on the trees, shining against the wet bark. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath. Max stood next to me, stiff, his ears pointing straight forward. Then I heard it again, something snapping underfoot out past the treeline. Not close, but not far either. Just the sound of a single footstep, heavy, deliberate. Max's body tensed completely, and a low growl came from his throat. I didn't move. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the dark. The rain softened again, and all I could hear was the creak somewhere down the slope. Eventually, I went back inside, closing the door tight and sliding the old wooden bar across it. Max stayed near the door, listening. I stayed up for hours after that, sitting on the edge of the cot with the lantern burning low, trying to convince myself it was an animal. A deer maybe, or a bear. I knew those woods had both, but the step I heard didn't sound like 4 legs. It sounded like one deliberate movement, slow and heavy. When I finally lay down, I couldn't sleep. The fire had died to embers, and every small creak in the wood made my stomach tighten. Around 3 in the morning, Max suddenly lifted his head. He didn't bark, but his ears shot up and his body went rigid again. I sat up slowly and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then it came, soft crunching, the sound of someone or something moving slowly around the cabin. The steps circled, pausing every few seconds, then continuing. I could hear them more clearly when they were near the window. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just sat there in the dark, listening. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Max stayed perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the door. The steps moved toward the porch. The boards outside creaked under weight. Then they stopped. I don't know how long I sat there, but it felt like an hour. Eventually, I heard nothing else. The woods went silent again, and even the rain faded. I stayed awake until dawn. When the gray light finally broke through the trees, I went outside with Max. The ground was soft from the rain, and I could see clear footprints near the porch. They weren't boots. They weren't paws either. They looked like bare human feet, long, narrow, and deep enough that whoever made them had some weight. The trail led from the trees to the cabin and then off toward the creek. I followed them a short distance, maybe 50 feet, before they disappeared into the mud and grass. Max stayed close behind me, sniffing the air. The woods felt heavier that morning, colder than they should have been. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching us from the trees all night. I stayed another day, but I couldn't relax. Every sound made me look toward the window. Even when I chopped firewood or tried to clean up inside, I found myself glancing toward the tree line. The footprints stayed visible near the porch all day, slowly softening as the sun came out. That night, I stacked a pile of wood near the door and left my lantern burning. Max slept against the door again, but I barely slept at all. Around midnight, the sound came back. Not footsteps this time, just something faint brushing against the wall outside, like a hand dragging across the wood. It moved slowly along the side of the cabin and stopped near the back window. I could hear Max's breathing change, low and anxious. I didn't go outside. I just sat there again, staring into the dark until the noise stopped. By morning, I had made up my mind. I packed up the truck, loaded Max in, and looked once more at the cabin. It didn't feel like my place anymore. The woods didn't feel the same either. They felt alive in a way I didn't understand, quiet, but not empty. As I drove back down the muddy road, I saw the outline of something in the distance near the creek. A figure, maybe standing still. It was too far to make out clearly, and I didn't stop to look closer. When I got back to town later that afternoon, I washed the mud off the truck and sat in the driveway for a long time, trying to think of what I'd say if someone asked how the trip went. I didn't tell anyone about the footprints or the sounds. I just said the cabin wasn't in great shape anymore. I never went back after that. I still think about that night sometimes, though, especially when it rains. I can still picture those prints by the porch, deep and clear in the mud, leading from the trees to my door like someone had been walking barefoot through the cold November woods, waiting for the light to go out. It was the fall of 1998 when I was stationed at Black Timber National Forest, a large stretch of pine and oak covering most of northern Montana. I was 33 at the time, a park ranger with 8 years under my belt. I'd been transferred to this part of the forest after one of the senior rangers retired. The cabin I was given sat deep in the woods, nearly 6 miles from the main ranger station, a small wooden structure meant for overnight patrols and logging wildlife data. It wasn't fancy, just a single room with a metal bed frame, a desk, a kerosene lamp, and a small stove. I'd stay there for 2 or 3 nights a week to monitor the back trails and note any animal movements or signs of illegal hunting. The first few weeks were quiet. I liked the silence, the kind that only exists miles away from other people. The air always smelled of pine and cold dirt, and at night the forest hummed with distant sounds, the soft croaks of frogs, the cracking of branches under deer hooves, the faint rush of wind through the trees. I usually kept a small fire going outside the cabin and took comfort in its glow. There was no electricity, so I'd rely on the lantern and the fire. I'd grown used to the isolation. It was part of the job. But around mid-October, I began noticing things that didn't quite sit right. At first, it was small. I'd find footprints near the cabin that weren't mine. Not boot prints either. They looked like regular shoes, maybe hiking boots, but lighter. The first time I saw them, I assumed a hunter had wandered close by. I made a note and moved on. The next week, I found them again. This time closer, circling around the back of the cabin, as if someone had walked around it at night. The dirt was slightly damp from rain, and the prints were fresh. I checked the area around the woodpile and the shed but didn't find anyone. I remember sitting inside the cabin that night, listening harder than usual. The rain started just after sunset, soft at first, then turning steady, drumming on the tin roof. I tried to write in my logbook, but I couldn't focus. The fire outside hissed under the rain, and every sound, every branch crack, every distant thud, felt sharper, closer. I told myself it was just an animal moving through the trees. I'd seen bears before, sometimes even wolves. It wasn't unusual. Still, the thought of someone wandering around in the dark unsettled me. The next morning, I checked the trail near the creek about a mile from the cabin. The mud there often kept clear tracks of anything that passed by. Sure enough, I found the same footprints heading west, the same shape, same tread pattern. They led toward the thicker part of the forest, an area rarely visited even by other rangers. I followed for about half a mile before the ground turned rocky, and the prints disappeared. I stood there for a while, just listening. The forest was dead quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. A few nights later, I woke up to a faint sound outside. It was just past 2 a.m., and the lantern had burned out. The fire was long gone, leaving only the faint smell of smoke. The sound was soft at first, like something brushing against the side of the cabin. I stayed still on the bed, listening. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate scrape against the wooden wall near the window. I reached for my flashlight, my heart thudding, and pointed it toward the noise. The beam hit the wall, nothing there. But when I stepped outside, I saw clear prints again, deep, clean, and heading toward the treeline. The forest beyond the clearing was pitch black, and I didn't follow. Not that night. I waited until morning and checked again. The tracks were still there, but this time, something else caught my attention. A pile of sticks laid neatly near the cabin door. Not random fallen branches, but a small stack almost arranged. I couldn't explain it. I didn't touch them, just looked at them and left them where they were. After that, I started keeping the rifle closer, leaning against the bedpost. I didn't report anything to the station yet. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I'd been alone for long stretches before. You start to think you're hearing things that aren't there, seeing shapes that don't exist. But then things started escalating. One afternoon, while returning from the creek trail, I noticed something in the dirt near the cabin window. A piece of cloth torn and caught under a rock. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve, dark green, frayed at the edge. I checked my own jacket just to be sure, but it wasn't mine. That meant someone else had been there again, close enough to brush against the cabin. I searched the area for more signs, but didn't find anything else. That night, I decided to stay up. I kept the lantern off, sitting by the window where I could see the clearing outside. The forest was quiet again, the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy. Around midnight, I caught movement near the trees. A shape, faint, barely visible through the dark. It stood still for a long time, almost blending into the shadows. It wasn't an animal. The height and shape were wrong. My breath felt heavy, and I didn't move. After what felt like minutes, the figure turned and slipped back into the trees without a sound. I barely slept. At dawn, I went to check the area where I saw it. The ground was soft from dew, and I found tracks again, leading away from the cabin. Same pattern, same shoe prints. I followed them for nearly a mile until I reached an old fire pit near a rock outcrop. It looked like it had been used recently, black ash still slightly damp. Beside it was an old tin can, opened with a knife, and a sleeping bag rolled up halfway. Whoever it was had been camping out there, watching me, or at least staying nearby. That's when it started making sense, the footprints, the sounds, the cloth. Someone was living in the forest, close enough to reach my cabin, maybe scavenging or hiding. I radioed the main station that day and told them I thought someone might be squatting deep in the park. They said they'd send another ranger out in a few days to check the area with me. Until then, I had to stay put. That night, the rain returned, heavier than before. I could barely hear anything over it, which made it worse. The storm muffled all the usual sounds, so I couldn't tell if something was moving outside or not. I sat near the stove, the rifle on my lap, trying to stay calm. Around 3 a.m., I noticed the faint sound of metal scraping, the latch on the shed outside. It was being moved. I froze. The shed was only a few feet from the cabin, where I kept extra fuel and firewood. I waited, barely breathing, hoping it was just the wind. Then the latch clicked again. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it through the window, but the rain blurred everything. I couldn't see more than a few feet out. The light caught something. A hand, pale, gripping the side of the shed door. I shouted once, but the hand was gone before I could react. I didn't step outside. I waited there, rifle ready, until the sky started turning gray. When daylight came, I checked the shed. The door was half open, and inside, a few fuel cans were missing. On the ground outside, muddy prints led away from it and vanished into the trees. I followed them again, this time further than before. After half an hour of walking, I found a small clearing with an old campsite. The ground was trampled, the fire pit cold, and one of my fuel cans was sitting beside a torn sleeping bag. Whoever had been staying there had left in a hurry. I reported everything later that morning. They sent a search team the next day, but the rain had washed most of the tracks away. They didn't find anyone, just a few scraps of clothing and the remains of the campsite. The theory was that it was a drifter, someone hiding in the forest, maybe trying to live off what they could find. I didn't stay in that cabin after that week. They reassigned me closer to the main station, but I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the quiet movements outside the walls, the soft scrape in the middle of the night. Even now, when I think back, what unsettles me most isn't what I saw, but what I didn't. Whoever was out there had been around for weeks, maybe longer, always close, always watching, without me knowing it. That thought stays with me, that silence, that invisible presence that was never far, living just beyond the edge of the light. It was late autumn when I found the old cabin behind the graveyard. I hadn't planned on staying there. My truck had broken down on a back road somewhere between Harrison and Marlow, two forgotten towns in northern Kentucky. It was getting dark fast, the air cold enough that my breath came out in thick clouds, and I didn't want to spend the night in the cab of the truck with no heat. I had one flashlight, half a thermos of coffee, and the sound of crickets dying out as the night crept in. That's when I saw the faint shape of a gate through the trees. The gate was old iron, bent at one hinge, and behind it stretched rows of crooked gravestones. Most of them leaned at angles, their names eroded by decades of wind and rain. The graveyard must have been abandoned a long time ago. The stone fence around it was crumbling, and there were weeds as tall as my knees. I figured there might be a caretaker's shed or some old building nearby where I could at least get out of the wind. When I looked deeper into the trees behind the graves, I spotted something. A roof line, half hidden by vines and branches. Took me about 10 minutes to reach it. The path was covered in mud and leaves, and the smell of damp earth got stronger the closer I got. The cabin was smaller than I expected, with a slanted tin roof that rattled when the wind hit it. One of the windows was cracked, and the door hung loosely on one hinge. The place looked forgotten, but there was something about it, something that made me feel like someone might have been here not too long ago. There were faint tire tracks in the mud behind the trees, and a pile of firewood stacked against the wall that didn't look completely rotten. I hesitated before going in, but the wind picked up, and it felt like the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. I pushed the door open, and it creaked so loud it echoed through the trees. Inside was the smell of old wood, mold, and something faintly metallic. The floorboards groaned under my boots. There was a single chair tipped on its side, a small wood stove in the corner, and a pile of old newspapers scattered near it. A spider's web hung from the ceiling like thin white threads, trembling in the breeze coming through a broken window pane. I set my flashlight on a shelf and started looking around. The newspapers were dated 1987. Most of them were from the same small local paper, the Marlow Gazette. One of the headlines caught my eye: "Caretaker found dead near Oakwood Cemetery." The story was short and vague, saying that a man named Harold Finch who'd been responsible for maintaining the cemetery, was found dead near his cabin. Foul play wasn't ruled out, but there were no suspects. I realized this must have been that cabin, the caretaker's place. The wind outside was howling now. I shut the door as best I could, wedging a chunk of wood in the crack so it wouldn't swing open again. I gathered some of the newspapers and stuffed them in the stove. There was some dry wood in a box beside it, so I lit a small fire. The warmth made the place feel slightly less miserable, though the smell of burning old paper filled the air. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall and pulled my jacket tighter. After a while, I started hearing sounds. They weren't anything unusual at first, just the kind of creaks and pops you hear in an old building at night. But then there was something else. It sounded like faint thumping, rhythmic and slow, coming from somewhere beneath the floor. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a possum trapped under the boards. I tried to ignore it, but it went on for a long time, stopping and starting again. I got up and walked across the room, pressing my boot down on the floorboards. The thumping stopped immediately. I waited for a few seconds, then pressed again, harder this time. The sound didn't come back, but I could feel a bit of give beneath the wood, like there was an empty space under there. I moved the chair and started pulling at one of the loose boards near the stove. After a few tries, I managed to pry it up with the edge of a rusty knife I found in a drawer. Underneath was a narrow crawl space, maybe 3 feet deep. The smell that came out of it was horrible, damp, earthy, mixed with something sour like rotting meat. I held my flashlight down there and saw what looked like a pile of rags or maybe an old blanket. Then I noticed it wasn't cloth. It was a coat, covered in dirt, and beside it, half buried in the soil, was a metal box. The box was heavy and rusted shut, but I managed to pry it open with the knife. Inside were a few strange things: a bundle of old letters, a pocket knife, and a small notebook with a leather cover. The notebook was soaked and fragile, but some pages were still legible. The handwriting was shaky and uneven. Most of it was notes about maintenance around the cemetery, things like replace fence post or trim oak by north wall. But near the end, the tone changed. One entry said, asterisk, something keeps moving the stones at night. I fixed them, they shift again. Asterisk, another said, asterisk, heard footsteps again. Thought it was vandals. No one there. Asterisk, I shut the notebook. My first thought was that Harold, the caretaker, had probably gone crazy out here. Living alone next to a graveyard for years could do that to anyone. But when I looked closer into the crawl space, I saw something else. A small pile of bones, maybe animal, maybe not. I couldn't tell in the dim light, but the sight of them made my stomach twist. The fire had died down to glowing coals by then, and the cold started creeping back in. I put the board back over the hole and sat near the stove again, trying not to think about what I'd seen. I figured I'd leave first thing in the morning, but sleep wouldn't come easy. Every time I started to drift off, I heard noises, faint dragging sounds outside, the rattle of something brushing against the window, and once the sound of what I swear was footsteps on the porch. I stayed awake all night, clutching the flashlight and staring at the door. Around 4 a.m., I noticed light flickering through the window, a dim orange glow coming from the direction of the graveyard. I stood up and looked outside. Down among the tombstones, I saw something burning. It looked like a small fire, but there was no one around. The thought crossed my mind that maybe some kids had come out here to mess around, lighting a bonfire or something. When daylight finally came, I packed my things and stepped outside. The fire I'd seen was gone. Not even smoke left. I walked through the graves toward where I'd seen it, but the ground was untouched, wet from dew, and there were no footprints or ashes anywhere. Only one thing was different. One of the graves looked freshly disturbed. The soil was darker and softer than the rest, like it had been dug up recently. I didn't stay to find out more. I walked back to the road, my boots heavy with mud, and followed the gravel until I saw my truck in the distance. A local tow truck driver stopped when he saw me and helped get it started again. I didn't tell him about the cabin or the crawl space. I just said I'd gotten stuck overnight near the cemetery. A few days later, after I got home, I looked up the story about Harold Finch. It turned out they never solved his death. Some people said he'd fallen into an open grave. Others thought he'd been attacked by someone passing through. But what caught my attention most was one small detail. The police report said his body was found inside the cabin, under a section of loose floorboards. I realized then that the crawl space I'd opened had once been where they found him. And that freshly disturbed grave I saw at dawn, it was right next to his. For weeks after that, I couldn't shake the memory. I kept thinking about the thumping under the floor, the rusted box, the faint fire in the graveyard. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The noises were animals, the fire a reflection of my own in the window. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattles my windows, I still hear that slow, steady thumping sound in the back of my head, like something buried deep down that refuses to stay still. And every now and then, I dream of that cabin, the one behind the old graveyard, and I can see it clearly, standing there in the cold, the door still hanging open, waiting for someone else to wander in. It was late October 2014. I was 32 then, working as a mechanic in northern Minnesota, and I remember the exact week because deer season had just opened. I had taken a few days off to get away from town, to clear my head and hunt in the deep woods like I used to with my father. He'd passed away a few years earlier, and I wanted to go back to the same kind of places he loved. Quiet, isolated, and miles from anyone. A coworker had mentioned an old hunting cabin out near Lake Vermilion that nobody had used in years. Said it was rough but standing. That sounded fine to me. I didn't need comfort, just a roof, a stove, and a dry floor. The drive up was longer than I expected. The road turned to gravel, then dirt, then what felt like a deer trail through thick pines and yellowing birches. The sun had dropped low by the time I found the clearing. The cabin stood there, gray wood, a rusted metal chimney, one window half-board, another with a spiderweb crack. The porch leaned slightly, and the steps were soft under my boots. A small shed sat about 20 yards behind it, half sunk into the ground, its door hanging open. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold earth. It had rained earlier, and everything was damp. When I pushed the cabin door open, it made a dry, screeching sound that echoed through the small single room. Inside was just as expected. A metal cot, a wood stove, a table with one leg propped up by an old boot, and a few empty shelves. Mice had chewed through one corner of the floorboards, and I saw droppings under the cot, but it was solid enough. I unpacked, lit the lantern, and got a fire going. That first night, I sat by the stove, listening to the wind move through the trees outside. The forest felt heavier than it had years ago, thicker, darker somehow. When I stepped outside before bed, I could barely see 10 feet into the woods. The moonlight hit the clearing like a faint blue mist, and beyond that was pure black. I heard something move once, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it stayed distant. I went back in, locked the door out of habit, and slept hard. The next morning was clear and cold. I left before dawn, rifle over my shoulder, a small pack with water and jerky. The woods were silent except for the sound of my boots crushing frost-coated leaves. Around mid-morning, I came across a narrow animal trail leading downhill, where I spotted fresh deer tracks, big ones. I followed them for maybe half a mile, deeper into the trees. That was when I started noticing small things. Broken branches about shoulder high, muddy patches where something heavy had moved through recently, and what looked like an old hunting blind made from stacked logs, mostly collapsed now. I set up nearby and waited for hours. Around noon, I heard something. A steady cracking of brush, slow, deliberate, not like a deer bounding or a bear crashing. It sounded like someone walking, stopping, then walking again. I froze. The sound moved off to my left, maybe 30 yards away, then faded. I stayed there until the sun dipped low, but whatever it was never came into view. I told myself it could have been another hunter, though I hadn't seen a truck for miles on the way in. When I returned to the cabin, the air had turned colder. The sky was bruised purple, and the woods were completely still. I noticed right away that the shed door behind the cabin, the one hanging open before, was now shut tight. Couldn't remember closing it. The latch looked freshly moved, the metal scraped. I stood there a while, staring, but I was tired and chalked it up to wind, or maybe I'd done it and forgotten. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every few minutes I heard faint sounds from outside, like footsteps in wet grass, or something brushing against the cabin wall. I sat up once, heart pounding, listening so hard I could hear the fire crackle and the ticking of the metal stove as it cooled. Eventually it went quiet again, and I must have dozed off. In the morning, I found boot prints behind the cabin. Not mine. I wear size 11 wide. These were smaller, lighter, maybe a size 9, and they circled from the back door of the cabin to the shed and back toward the tree line. The dirt was soft enough that they couldn't have been old. I felt a tightness in my chest, that kind of gut feeling when something's not right. I checked my gear, my rifle, and made sure everything was still there. I walked to the shed to check it out. The door creaked as I pulled it open. Inside, it was dark and smelled like oil and damp wood. There was an old workbench against one wall, some rusted traps, a cracked lantern, and what looked like a pair of torn gloves. In the dirt near the center was another boot print, same size as the ones outside. It pointed toward the door, like whoever made it had stood there watching the cabin. I backed out, closed the door again, and slid a thick branch through the latch to keep it shut. I didn't hunt that day. I stayed around the cabin, listening and keeping close to the fire. The feeling of being watched never really left. Around sunset, I noticed movement far down the trail leading in. A figure, maybe 100 yards away, standing still among the trees. Too far to make out clearly, just the shape of someone, broad shoulders, a hood or hat. I raised my rifle slightly but didn't aim. I blinked, and when I looked again, they were gone. I didn't eat much that night. I locked the door, stacked firewood inside, and kept the lantern lit until it burned out. I hardly slept. Every sound made me flinch. The snap of a branch, the shifting of the cabin walls in the cold. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard soft scraping on the porch, slow and steady. My hand went to my rifle. The scraping stopped, then came again. I stayed still, breathing through my nose, waiting, after what felt like forever silence. When dawn came, I went outside carefully. The frost was thick and white, and there were fresh prints leading from the porch steps to the edge of the clearing. I followed them until they vanished among the trees. I couldn't tell which way they went after that. The ground was too hard. I stood there for a long time trying to figure out what to do. I still had another 2 days planned, but I felt the instinct to leave. Every part of me said I wasn't alone out there. Before leaving, I went back into the cabin to pack. As I lifted my duffel, I noticed something on the floor under the cot. A folded piece of paper, slightly damp and brown around the edges. I hadn't seen it before. It was a torn bit of notebook paper with writing on it, faded but readable. It said, in shaky handwriting, "Don't stay here after dark." I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't old enough to be from decades ago. The ink hadn't run much and the fold was still crisp. Someone had been there not long before me. I threw my gear in the truck and started the drive out. The forest felt tighter as I went, the trees leaning in, shadows cutting across the dirt road. About 10 minutes down, I caught something in the rearview mirror. a figure stepping out into the road behind me, just standing there watching as I drove away. I didn't slow down. When I finally hit paved road and got cell service again, I stopped at a small gas station. The clerk saw the mud on my truck and asked if I'd been hunting up near Vermilion. I said yes. He told me a few guys used to go out there years ago but stopped after a strange drifter started showing up around their camps at night. Never violent, just watching, sometimes taking things, leaving notes. Nobody knew where he came from. And after a few reports, the county sheriff checked but never found him. I didn't go back. A few weeks later, I read online about an abandoned cabin near that same area burning down. The article said they didn't find anyone inside but noted footprints in the mud leading away from the site. Even now, when I think about that trip, I remember how real the silence felt out there. No ghosts, no monsters, just a person, maybe more desperate than dangerous, living where no one would bother them. But I still wonder why they watched, why they waited until dark, and why that note was left under the cot. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I catch myself thinking about the sound of that slow scraping on the porch, the steady, patient rhythm of it, like someone who had done it many times before. It was late October of 2013 when I decided to drive out toward the northern woods of Montana. I had been feeling stuck for months. Same routine, same city noises, same walls, and I wanted a few quiet days to clear my head. I rented a small place through a listing I found online, an old hunting cabin that was supposedly owned by a man who hadn't used it for years. The price was cheap, and the pictures showed a small wooden structure surrounded by trees, with a small lake not far behind it. It looked peaceful enough. The drive there took nearly 7 hours. The paved road eventually turned into cracked gravel, and after that, it was only dirt. My truck bounced and rattled as I went deeper into the woods. The trees became thicker, darker, and the air colder. I remember checking my phone, no signal. I didn't care much. I thought maybe it was what I needed. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had already dropped behind the tree line. The sky was dark blue with a thin streak of orange on the horizon. The cabin looked smaller in person. The wood was gray and cracked, the roof sagging a little on one side. The porch steps creaked under my boots. A few dead leaves were stuck against the door frame, and a half-broken lantern hung crooked from a nail beside the door. Inside, it smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, maybe rust. There was a table in the middle with 2 wooden chairs, a small sink that didn't look like it worked, and a cot in the corner with an old mattress that had stains I didn't want to think about. A few spider webs hung in the corners of the ceiling. I unpacked my sleeping bag, a small gas stove, and some canned food. That first night, I lit a few candles and listened to the quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, though. It was heavy, the kind that made every small sound stick out. The faint creaks of the wood, the occasional rustle outside, a low groan when the wind hit the walls just right. I tried not to think too much about it and fell asleep around midnight, wrapped in my sleeping bag, the candle burning low beside me. When I woke up the next morning, the air was freezing. My breath was white. I went outside to get some wood from the small pile near the side of the cabin, but most of it was soaked. The ground was damp, and the sky was gray. The trees stood still, not even a hint of wind. I made a small fire inside and boiled water for instant coffee. The sound of boiling water was the only thing breaking the silence. Later that day, I decided to take a walk toward the lake behind the cabin. It was about a 10-minute walk through thick trees and brush. The path was narrow, with broken branches and uneven ground. The lake was still when I got there, completely flat, like glass. The reflection of the trees and the dull sky made it look almost black. I stood there for a while, just listening. That's when I noticed something, faint but distinct. A crunching sound, like footsteps on dead leaves, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, expecting maybe an animal, but there was nothing, just trees. I waited, listening, but it stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe even just the sound of branches shifting under their own weight. I walked back to the cabin, but the feeling stayed with me, like someone had been standing there, watching me from the tree line. By the third day, I started to notice small things that felt off. I found footprints in the dirt near the back of the cabin, not mine. They were larger boot prints, and they led around the back to where an old shed stood about 30 feet away. The shed looked worse than the cabin. The door was half hanging off, and part of the roof had caved in. I hadn't gone inside before, but now curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open carefully. Inside, there were old tools scattered on the floor, rusted saws, a hammer, and a cracked lantern. A few animal traps were hanging from nails. Everything looked untouched for years, but the thing that caught my eye was an old, folded tarp in the corner, and beneath it, a small pile of bones. Animal bones, probably. They were small, maybe from rabbits or raccoons. Still, the way they were arranged, neat, almost lined up, didn't feel right. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The wind had picked up, and the cabin made all kinds of noises, scraping, shifting, groaning. I tried to ignore them, but sometime past midnight, I heard something different. It was faint at first, like a soft dragging sound just outside the cabin wall. Then a dull thump, then another. I froze. I didn't move or breathe for a minute, just listening. It went quiet again, but after a few seconds, I heard it again. A soft step on the porch, the old wood creaking slightly. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move from the cot. I just stared at the dark ceiling, waiting. The sound lasted maybe a minute, then it stopped completely. I lay awake for hours, staring into the dark, until the first light of morning came through the window. When I finally stepped outside, the ground was damp from a light rain. I looked at the porch, and there, on the dirt just below the steps, were more boot prints. Fresh ones, the same size as the ones behind the cabin. They led around the side and disappeared into the trees. I thought about packing up right then and leaving, but my truck was parked down the small slope, and I didn't want to believe that someone was actually there. I convinced myself maybe it was an old hunter, maybe someone who used to come here and didn't know anyone was renting the place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That evening, I double-checked that the door was locked. I even stacked a few pieces of wood against it just in case. The candlelight flickered on the walls, and every shadow seemed to stretch too long. I could hear the wind outside, and once or twice I thought I heard faint movement. Branches snapping, maybe steps far off. Around midnight, I heard something again. The same slow creaking of the porch, followed by the faint scrape of metal on wood. My chest tightened. I stayed still, barely breathing. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then came again, this time closer to the door. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too careful, too deliberate. Then I heard a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground outside. I didn't want to move, didn't even want to look toward the door. My mind was racing. Who would be out there this late, in the middle of nowhere? I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. The dragging stopped after a few minutes, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that pressed against your ears. When morning finally came, I walked outside slowly, every muscle tight. The dirt in front of the porch was disturbed. Marks like something heavy had been pulled across it, leading toward the trees. The tracks disappeared not far from the edge of the forest. That was it for me. I packed my bag, threw it into the truck, and didn't bother cleaning up. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin stood there, small and gray, half hidden by the trees. When I reached the nearest gas station an hour later, I told the old man working there about the cabin. He nodded like he already knew which one I meant. He said it used to belong to a man named George Miller, a hunter who went missing back in 2002. Nobody ever found him, just his gear and an old truck parked near that same lake. After that, no one stayed long in that cabin. I didn't go back. I still think about those footprints, though. The way they appeared every night, never overlapping, always new. Someone had been walking there, maybe watching, waiting. And the thought that unsettles me most isn't that someone was out there in those woods. It's that they might still be. It was early October of 2014 when I decided to spend a few weeks at my uncle's old farm in northern Nebraska. I was 28 back then, tired of the city and the endless noise that came with it. The farm sat a few miles off a 2-lane road, surrounded by fields that stretched out so far they looked like they touched the horizon. The main house had been empty for a while since my uncle passed, but the small cabin near the barn was still in decent shape, at least from what I remembered as a kid. I thought some quiet time out there might clear my head. When I first arrived, the sky was cloudy and low, the kind of gray that makes the air feel heavy. The fields looked dead and forgotten, with dry corn stalks leaning sideways and weeds growing in the cracks of the old driveway. The cabin was just as I pictured it, wood darkened from years of weather, a small porch with half the railing missing, and a single window that had a faint yellow tint from dust. It had one small bedroom, a kitchen with a wood stove, and a single oil lamp hanging from a nail. I unloaded my stuff and walked around the property to get a sense of what needed attention. The barn was huge and old, with planks missing along the side and a tin roof that rattled every time the wind passed through. Inside, the smell of hay and rust mixed together. There were broken tools scattered around, rusted shovels, an old pitchfork, a few cracked buckets. A raccoon darted across the rafters when I walked in. The fields behind it rolled out endlessly, quiet except for the wind. That first night, I lit the oil lamp and made myself some canned soup on a small gas burner. The silence was deep. You don't really understand how quiet the countryside can be until you're there alone. No traffic, no people, no lights, just insects, the distant sound of wind through dead crops, and the occasional creak from the cabin's wood. I remember lying in bed, feeling that silence press down on me like a blanket. It wasn't peaceful, it was too absolute. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise. It was like something brushing against the outside wall. It wasn't the wind. It was slower, more deliberate. I stayed still, listening. After a few seconds, it stopped. I thought maybe an animal was moving through the grass or scratching itself against the wall. I tried to fall back asleep, but my ears stayed alert, waiting for it again. It didn't come back that night. The next morning, I found some faint marks near the side of the cabin, mud streaks, like something had rubbed against the lower boards. There were a few footprints nearby, not clear enough to tell what they belonged to, but big enough that I guessed a deer or maybe a stray dog had wandered close. I didn't think much of it and went about cleaning the place up. That evening, I walked down past the barn toward a small pond that had nearly dried out. The ground around it was cracked and soft in spots. I saw tire marks, fresh ones, pressed into the mud. That struck me as odd because the nearest neighbor was about 2 miles away, and no one had any reason to come out there. The farm wasn't exactly welcoming. Overgrown fields, a rusted gate, and a fence barely holding itself upright. Still, I figured maybe someone had been hunting or checking the land. That night, the sound came again. This time, it was closer to the window, a dragging noise, soft but steady, moving slowly along the side of the cabin. I didn't have a gun, just a heavy flashlight. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and waited. The noise stopped again after a few seconds. I listened for footsteps or breathing but heard nothing. The quiet afterward was worse than the noise itself. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. The grass was bent down along the edge of the cabin like something had moved through it during the night. More prints, clearer this time. They were large, human-shaped but uneven, like whoever made them wasn't walking right. I followed them a few yards before they faded into the dry soil. I tried to convince myself it was just some local kid messing around, but that didn't make sense either. Nobody came this far out for fun. The following days, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd go out to fetch water from the old pump or gather firewood and feel eyes on me from somewhere in the field. Every time I looked, there was nothing but tall grass and empty land. One afternoon, while checking the barn, I found something I hadn't noticed before. Near the back wall, behind a stack of old crates, there was a sleeping bag and some wrappers. Someone had been living there. It looked like they'd been gone for a few days, but the smell was still fresh, a sour human odor. That was when the unease turned into something heavier. Someone was definitely on the property, hiding out somewhere close. I dragged the sleeping bag outside and left it in the open, hoping it might send a message that I knew someone was there. That night, I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., the dragging sound came back, louder this time, moving along the porch. The wood creaked under weight. Then silence again. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After what felt like forever, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps moving away through the dry grass. The next morning, I packed my truck, ready to leave. I told myself I'd come back later with someone else, maybe contact the sheriff. But before leaving, I decided to check the barn one more time. The air inside felt colder. When I reached the back wall, I noticed the sleeping bag was back inside. Not the same one, it was newer, blue, clean, and zipped closed. I hesitated before pulling it open. Inside was a pile of clothes. Men's clothes, all dirty and torn, like they'd been worn for weeks straight. That was enough for me. I got in my truck and drove down the dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't look back at the barn or the cabin. A few days later, I called the county office to report what I found. They sent a deputy to check the place out. He called me afterward to say there were signs someone had been staying there recently, but no one was around. A few prints, some trash, and a rusted hunting knife were all they found. They said it was probably a drifter or someone living off-grid. For a while, I tried to forget about it, but a week after I got home, I got a call from that same deputy. He sounded uneasy. He told me they found something buried near the edge of the property line. A shallow pit with a few personal items inside. A wallet, some old boots, and a photo of a man and a woman. The wallet belonged to a man who'd gone missing from a nearby town 3 months earlier. I didn't go back to that farm again. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those uneven footprints and the quiet drag of something moving outside the cabin walls. Whoever had been there wasn't lost or wandering. They were staying close, watching. And if I hadn't left that morning, I think they might have decided it was time to step inside. The farm was sold a year later. The new owner tore down the cabin and cleared the fields. I drove past it once. Everything was gone except the old barn, standing there alone. The roof still rattled in the wind, same as it always did. I never stopped to look inside. It had been 5 years since I turned in my badge. 30 years on the force had worn me down. Too many long nights, too many faces I couldn't forget, and too many cases that never found a clean ending. I bought a small piece of land in northern Montana after retirement. It sat deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest paved road. There was an old hunting cabin there that I fixed up bit by bit, mostly by myself. The quiet suited me. After decades of city noise, gunshots, and police radios, I just wanted to hear the wind and the creek outside. The cabin wasn't much. 2 rooms, a tin roof, a small wood stove, and a front porch that leaned slightly to the left. I liked its imperfections. Every crack in the floorboards, every creak of the old wooden steps. It all felt honest. Out here, I didn't have to deal with people lying to my face. I just split firewood, fished when the weather allowed, and spent evenings on the porch with a cup of coffee that was always too strong. It was late October 2012 when things changed. The air had that cold bite that told me snow wasn't far off. I'd been out checking some traps a few miles north of the property when I noticed something odd. There were tire tracks cutting through the mud near the treeline, fresh ones, wide treads, probably from a truck or SUV. No one ever came down that path. It wasn't even marked on most maps. The tracks went deeper into the woods, toward a narrow trail that ended near the ridge behind my land. I followed them for a while, mostly out of habit. Once a cop, always a cop. They say that for a reason. My instincts still kicked in even when I didn't want them to. About a half-mile up, the trail started getting too tight for a vehicle, but I noticed marks on some of the branches, broken twigs, scuffed bark. Someone had forced their way through there. I figured maybe a lost hunter or someone dumping trash, which happened more than it should out there. When I came back that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about those tire tracks. They looked too recent. I ended up taking my flashlight and hiking back out after sunset. The woods were silent except for the occasional snap of branches under my boots. The beam of my light caught the mist hanging low near the ground, swirling around the brush like smoke. A few hundred yards up, the smell hit me. That thick, sweet rot that never leaves your memory once you've smelled it before. I'd smelled it too many times during my career, decomposing flesh. My first thought was maybe a deer carcass, but as I got closer, I saw the outline of something that wasn't an animal. It was a man, lying on his side near a fallen log, his body half covered in leaves like someone had tried to hide him but gave up halfway through. He looked to have been there maybe a few days, maybe more. The cold nights had slowed decomposition, but not enough. His skin had turned pale, his clothes soaked in mud. I crouched beside him, careful not to disturb the area too much. I still had my old habits. I checked for any kind of ID, but his pockets were empty. His jacket was torn near the shoulder, and there was a dark hole in his side, gunshot wound, probably close range. No wallet, no phone, no keys. Whoever left him there didn't want him identified easily. I stood there for a while, the flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. It had been years since I'd seen a fresh crime scene, and something in me stirred again. The same mix of anger and focus I used to feel back when I was on duty. Only this time, there was no backup, no partner watching my six, no radio to call it in. Just me and a body in the middle of nowhere. By the time I made it back to the cabin, it was past midnight. The woods had gone quiet again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I set my rifle near the door and sat at the table for a long time, thinking. The right thing to do was obvious: call the sheriff's department, report the body. But something about it didn't sit right. That trail wasn't used by locals, and I hadn't heard a single vehicle pass by in weeks. Whoever dumped that body knew where to hide it. I ended up calling it in the next morning using my satellite phone. They sent a deputy and an investigator out by noon. The deputy was young, maybe 25, and looked uncomfortable the moment he saw the body. The investigator barely spoke, just took notes and photos. They told me they'd keep me updated, but I could tell by their faces they didn't like being that deep in the woods. A few days passed, and the quiet of the forest returned. But something about it had changed. I noticed new sets of tire tracks near the old trail again. Same tread pattern. One morning, I found the latch on my storage shed broken, but nothing was taken. Just the latch snapped clean off, like someone had tried to pry it open but got interrupted. At night, I started keeping my lights off and sitting near the window with my rifle across my lap. The moonlight made the trees look alive, swaying in the wind, throwing shadows across the clearing. A few times I thought I saw movement near the treeline, but it could have been deer, or it could have been something else. The sheriff's office called a week later. They said the dead man was identified as a drifter from out of state. No fixed address, no close relatives. They had nothing else to go on. Case open, but probably going nowhere. I could tell by the way the deputy spoke that they were done with it. Just another unsolved death buried under paperwork. But I couldn't let it go. The man had been killed close to my property. That meant whoever did it had been out there, maybe watching, maybe even near my cabin. I went back to the spot one last time, hoping to find something the investigators missed. The leaves had thickened since the last time, and frost covered most of the ground. I spent hours searching in silence until I found something wedged under a rock near the log. A spent shell casing, .45 caliber. I pocketed it and went back home. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled against the windows, and somewhere out in the dark, I heard the crunch of gravel. I killed the lantern and waited, every muscle in my body tight. The sound came again, slow footsteps moving past the porch. I sat there, gripping the rifle, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then the sound faded, replaced by the steady hum of the night. When morning came, I stepped outside and found footprints near the steps. Heavy boots, same pattern as before. They led toward the woods, the same direction as the tire tracks. Whoever had been there wasn't lost. They were checking on something. Maybe on me. I packed my truck that afternoon. I took only what I needed, my rifle, some cash, a few clothes, and the shell casing. I drove out before dark, heading south toward the next town. I stopped at the sheriff's office and dropped off the casing without saying a word, just left it in an envelope with a note. Star .45 casing found near the body site. Likely connected. Check for prints. Asterisk, they never called me again. I never went back to that cabin either. I sold the land a few months later through an agent. Never even met the buyer. Sometimes, though, I still think about that place. The smell of pine, the way the mist hung low over the creek, and the silence that followed me everywhere. But mostly, I think about those footprints. The size of them, the direction they faced. They weren't coming from the woods. They were heading back toward them, which meant whoever killed that man had come out from somewhere close. Maybe one of the old cabins scattered deeper in the forest, the ones forgotten over the years. Every now and then, I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear gravel crunching outside again. Old habits die hard. I tell myself it's nothing, that I'm far from those woods now. But part of me knows better. Some things you don't just leave behind. You carry them like the weight of a badge you can never really take off. It was late October of 1997 when I decided to take a week off from work and head up north to a small cabin I had bought 2 years earlier in the woods of northern Montana. I was 39 at the time, tired of city noise, tired of streetlights and sirens that never let the night stay dark. The cabin wasn't much, just a single bedroom, a wood stove, a creaky porch, and a view of the valley below that looked empty for miles. I had built most of it myself over 2 summers, piece by piece, with cheap lumber and rusted nails that I scavenged from old barns. I liked that place because it felt cut off from everything. No neighbors, no cars, no one to bother me. The drive from Helena took almost 5 hours, half of it on cracked roads and the rest on a dirt trail that looked like it hadn't seen another tire in years. When I finally pulled up, the sky was the color of steel, the wind running cold through the trees. I unpacked slow, just canned food, a small gas lamp, some firewood, and a thermos of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. I had no plans except to fish in the creek and maybe cut some fallen branches for kindling. The first 2 days were quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I woke early, lit the stove, made coffee, and spent most of the mornings walking down the slope behind the cabin. The forest there was thick with pine and spruce, and when the wind blew, you could hear the whole place groan like it was alive. I remember thinking how still it all felt. I didn't even hear birds sometimes, just that low, heavy sound of branches shifting. On the third morning, I noticed something odd near the tree line behind the cabin. About 50 feet from the porch, the ground dipped slightly, and there was a patch of dirt that looked freshly turned. The rest of the forest floor was covered in needles and roots, but that spot looked different. Flat, darker, like someone had dug and filled it recently. I stared at it for a while but didn't go closer. There were plenty of animals around. Bears sometimes dug for insects or coyotes buried food. I told myself it was nothing. That night, the wind picked up hard. The cabin walls creaked, and the roof made small snapping sounds every few minutes. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise outside. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, something brushing against the porch planks. I stayed still, listening. Came again, slow and scraping. I thought maybe it was a branch knocking in the wind. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and opened the door. The beam of light swept across the porch. Nothing, just the forest pushing in dark all around. I stood there for a while, hearing my own breath, the faint hiss of the lamp behind me. The wind cut through my shirt and made me shiver. I went back in and locked the door, though the lock was barely more than a bent piece of metal I'd screwed in myself. The next morning, I saw something that made me stop. The dirt patch behind the cabin, it had been dug again. The soil looked freshly disturbed, and there were boot prints around it. Clear ones, human ones. My stomach dropped when I saw that the prints came from the woods, circled the hole, and then led straight toward the cabin before turning back. I checked the whole area, scanning the ground, the trees, the slope. There were no signs of any vehicle tracks or other movement. It didn't make sense. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. The nearest ranger station was about 15 miles away, and the old trail I drove up on wasn't something people stumbled across by mistake. I spent most of that day sitting on the porch with my rifle across my lap, listening for anything unusual. That night was colder, the kind of cold that crawls under your clothes and sits in your bones. Couldn't sleep much. Every small noise outside felt sharper. Around 2 a.m., I heard that scraping again, closer this time, not from the porch, but from the side of the cabin. I sat up in bed, staring at the wall, listening. It sounded like someone dragging something heavy through the leaves. Then it stopped. I got up, took the flashlight and rifle, and stepped outside through the back door. The air hit me hard, cold, still, and heavy. The beam of the flashlight cut through the trees, but it caught nothing but trunks and fog. Then I turned it toward the dirt patch. My stomach twisted. The ground was open again. A hole about 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep. That was when I noticed something else. Just beside it, near the edge of the dug-up dirt, there was a tarp, old, torn, and covered in soil. My light caught a glimpse of what was beneath it, just enough to freeze me in place. It wasn't an animal. It was a boot. I stepped closer, heart hammering, until the beam of light showed the rest. The tarp half covered what looked like a human body. The jeans were ripped, the skin pale and stiff. I didn't move for what felt like a full minute. The air seemed to stop moving. I finally backed away, almost tripping over a root. I went back inside, locked every door, pushed a chair against the front one, and sat there until sunrise. My mind kept racing. Who was that? How long had that been there? And why had someone been digging it up? When morning came, I packed my things fast. I didn't care about leaving food or clothes behind. I threw everything in the truck and got ready to drive out. But before I left, I forced myself to take one last look. I walked to the dirt patch again. The hole was filled back in, smooth, like nothing had ever been there. I didn't have time to dig again or try to prove anything. The forest was too quiet, the air too heavy. I drove off, bouncing over the dirt trail, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds. I reached the main road by noon, my hands stiff on the steering wheel. When I finally got to the small sheriff's office near Wolf Creek, I went inside and told them what I found. They sent a deputy and 2 search guys up there that same evening. I waited at a diner nearby until they came back. When they did, they said they found the cabin but no sign of any disturbed ground. No tarp, no body. They said the area behind the cabin looked untouched. I told them they were wrong, that I had seen it with my own eyes, but they only nodded and said they'd keep it on file. I never went back to that cabin after that. I sold the land 3 months later through an agent without stepping foot on it again. The man who bought it said he wanted to turn it into a hunting camp. I didn't tell him anything. Years later, I still think about that spot. I can picture it exactly. The slope, the trees, the dark dirt that looked freshly dug. Sometimes, when I drive north and see the tree line, I wonder if whoever was buried there ever got found, or if the forest just swallowed them again. What keeps me up isn't the body itself. It's the fact that someone was out there the same nights I was. Someone who knew how to move quietly, who came and went without leaving a trace except those boot prints. Sometimes I think about that noise, the scraping, the dragging, and how close it was to my wall. And I realize now, after all these years, that maybe the reason the hole was filled back in by morning wasn't because someone hid it again. Maybe they were covering it up because they didn't want anyone to find it. Maybe they didn't expect anyone to be there at all. And maybe, when I opened that cabin door that night with my flashlight, I was only a few seconds away from being the next body buried in that dirt.